In previous tutorial, we saw how we can make games using either traditional coding or using visual and graphical tools like GameMaker. In this tutorial, we are going to review the basic process of creating a simple game using GameMaker. If you remember, the sample game that we did show was very simple and made of 3 different types of objects. Those that can move by the player, those that can move by the game itself, and those that are stationary and the player interact with. In our simple game, we're going to go through the process of creating such object and creating a simple game that we just demonstrated. We start by creating a new project in GameMaker. Just to give it a name, Project 2, and create. GameMaker divide the entities that you work with into a series of game assets, which are files that you create and you use in the game, like images, sounds, and things like that, and also entities in the game that are the basic elements of the game itself. Every game starts with one basic entity, which is called a room or a game level. That's where all of the actions happen. To create a room, simply right-click on the room option and select create a room. You can set different settings for a room, including its size and its background color. You can just go with the default values. And it's called room 0. The next thing, we want to put some objects in this room. In our typical game that we just created, we have 3 objects. It was the player, enemy, and item that we want to pick up. Right click on the object, create an object called player. For now you can leave everything as it is. Another object called enemy, and another object called item. Now if you notice, you can always open any one of these objects again by double clicking on it. These objects have no shape. Right under the name there is an option for sprite, and there is no sprite for this object. Sprites are simple images that are usually used for characters and objects in a game. In order to have a sprite or a shape for any of your objects, we need to add an asset to our project. Right click on sprite and select create sprite. You can give it any name. So for example, if this is going to be the shape for the player, we can call it player sprite. And you can load any image file that you have already created somewhere. In this case, I have created a folder named sprites under my project folder, and I have all of the shapes that I want in that folder. I'm going to do the same thing for the other shapes. The enemy sprite and item sprite. Now we can assign these shapes to the objects that we have in the game. And we do that for all of the objects. Now that all of the objects have shapes, we can go back to our room and start placing the objects in the room. Go to the tab called Object, and it shows which object is currently selected. So it's the player. If you click somewhere, the object will be placed there. You can change and select another object. So now we have the item as a selected object, and you can put as many items as you want in different places on the screen. And then finally, we select the enemy and we place 3 enemies on the screen. At this point, we are ready to run our game. To run a game at any time, you can click on the green arrow up here. And your game will be executed. At this point, we have created the front end of our game. So all of the objects and the visuals are there, but as you noticed, there was no actions on the game. The actual activities in the game are defined by creating different behaviors. In GameMaker, the behavior of the program is defined through 2 things: events, which are things that happen like a user input, and actions, which are responses that the game performs. Let's say, for example, we want the player to move using keyboards. We start by creating an event, and we create a response. There are a whole bunch of options for responses, and the first one and most commonly used is move. We can define move in what direction and with what speed, and select OK. Click OK and run the game again. Now if I press the right key, the player starts to move. You will notice that if I release the right key, it continues movement because we have given it a speed. So we can go back here, add another event, key release, right key, drag the move, and set the speed back to 0. Now the player is controlled using the keys. We can do this for all the 4 directions, so the player can be controlled in 4 directions. We can do the same activity for all of different directions, and you'll notice that we have press and release for 4 directions. Now if you run the game, you can move the player in 4 directions. Next step, we want to make sure that the enemies move automatically themselves. We go back to the enemy object and add a new event called create. This event means that as soon as the game is created, and we're going to give some movement to all of the players as soon as the game starts. For example, starting in the right direction with a speed of 3. And we can see the result of that. But you notice that the enemies are getting out of the screen. In order to fix that, we want to create a wall around this room so the enemies bounce back and stay in the room. In order to make the enemies bounce back from the edge of the room, I created a new item, a new object called wall. You can see that a new sprite has been added and a new object with that particular sprite. To make the bouncing work, I selected the option solid for this particular object. Now I go to the enemy and I create a new event called collision with wall, and I select the action bounce. All the properties are okay, and I run the game. And you see that the objects are bouncing back the enemies. To make it a little more interesting, we can make the enemies move to move in a different direction. So the move is a little more interesting. And now they start bouncing back around the screen. You can change the number of enemies to make it even more exciting for the game. Now the last option is to make the same thing and do something for the item so the player can pick up the items. So we can go back here, add an event, collision with an item. And then what we can do here is to move this option to another place. So you can see that there are a whole bunch of different options for the movements. For example, one of them is called jump. So if we remove the jump, and here in applies to, we select other. That means when the player hits an item, the item will jump to a particular location. Move it to a location off the screen, 2000, and select OK. Now you notice that we are picking object. When the collision between player and one of the items happen, the item will be moved to the location 2000, 2000, which is off the screen. So we don't see it. This was a very quick review of some of the basic actions that we need in a simple game involving 3 different types of object: the player object, enemies, and stationary objects. As an extra challenge for yourself, implement the collision between the player and the enemies and end the game when that happens.